Today, we read Chapter 9 of Helen Keller by Margaret Davidson. This chapter is called College. More and more people were hearing about Helen. Newspaper reporters wrote stories about her. A shipbuilder in Maine named a ship after her. Important people everywhere were becoming her friends. 12-year-old Helen was even invited to the White House to meet the President of the United States. Most of the time, Helen was not visiting such important people. Most of the time, she was doing much simpler things. Things she liked just as well. When she was home in Tuscumbia, she rode her horse, Black Beauty. She took her dogs for walks in the sweet-smelling woods, and she spent hours every day close to her mother's side. A friend gave Helen a bicycle called a tandem, a bicycle built for two. Helen sat behind and pushed the pedals. Someone else sat up front and steered. One summer, Helen learned how to swim. She even worked out a way to swim by herself. She tied one end of a rope around her waist. She tied the other end of the rope around a rock or a tree. Then she could swim safely. And when she was tired, she followed the rope to shore. Boy, that Helen is quite the thinker. She comes up with solutions to problems. Helen learned how to row a boat by herself too. She could tell where she was by the different smells of grasses and bushes that grew on the bank. Helen and teacher usually spent the summer months at home in Tuscumbia. They spent most of the winter months studying in Boston or visiting friends in the countryside nearby. How Helen loved to be outside on those cold wintry days. She loved to feel the air stinging her face. She liked to zip down the snowy hills on the back of a sled. Helen helped her friends build snowmen. She felt snowflakes melt in her hand as teacher described their many different shapes. In the evening, Helen and teacher roasted apples or popped popcorn or played quiet games in front of the fire. Sometimes they played cards. Helen had to have special cards, of course. Each card had a different pattern of raised bumps on it so that she could tell them apart. Other times they played checkers. The black checkers were flat on top. The red checkers were round. Best of all were the evenings when friends came to call. Teacher spelled what they were saying to Helen, but every once in a while, teacher grew so interested herself that she forgot to spell. Then Helen would say loudly, "What's going on?" Helen Keller hated to be left out of anything. By the way, earlier in this paragraph it said, best of all were the evenings when friends came to call. In this meaning, they're not actually talking about someone calling like we call on a phone. In these days, when people came to call, that actually meant they came for a visit. But Helen had less and less time for romps in the snow or quiet evenings by the fire. Now she had a new goal. I want to go to college when I grow up. 12-year-old Helen announced one day. And the college I want to go to is Harvard. I don't know if you've ever heard of Harvard, but Harvard is probably one of the most expensive and an incredibly hard school to get into. You have to be an A++ student to get into Harvard. Teacher felt like saying no. In college, Helen would have to keep up with students who could see their books and hear their teachers talk. Helen was very, very bright. Yet, how could anyone, no matter how bright, possibly do that? But teacher also thought that Helen had the right to try. So, all she said was, "Not Harvard, Helen. That's a boys' school." And they started to work. Latin, Greek, German, French, geography, zoology, history, biology, mathematics. There were so many things to learn before Helen could even try to get into college. Sometimes she studied with other teachers. Sometimes she and teacher stayed at home and studied by themselves. Wherever she was, she worked many long hours every day. 6 busy years passed. At last, Helen was ready. Then she discovered a very upsetting fact. Helen Keller was ready for college, but college wasn't ready for her. Helen wanted to go to Radcliffe, a very well-known women's college, But the president of Radcliffe didn't want to take Helen. He thought she would cause too many problems. "You have come a long way," he told her, "but surely you will not be able to keep up with our girls." Helen hated to be treated like this. She sat down and wrote a letter. Do you think the letter that she would write would perhaps be a persuasive letter if she's trying to persuade the school to let her become a student there? Here we go. Helen hated to be treated like this. She sat down and wrote a letter. "You must let me try," she wrote to the president of Radcliffe, "for a true soldier does not admit defeat before the battle." Helen's spirit must have impressed the president of Radcliffe. He changed his mind. In the fall of 1900, Helen Keller entered Radcliffe College. So in order for someone to change their mind, they had to be persuaded. Helen must have done a very good job of persuading the president to let her come to school. She had worked hard before. She worked twice as hard now. Teacher always sat beside Helen in class and spelled into her hand what the teacher was saying. But sometimes her fingers could not keep up with his voice. Then Helen simply missed a part of the lesson. Helen didn't have time to take notes. She had to remember everything without them. When she took a test, she could not look back over what she had written. She had to get everything right the very first time. And there were so many books to read. Helen read Braille and raised print books until her fingertips bled. But most of the books were not in raised print. Teacher had to read these other books to her. Poor teacher. Her sick eyes grew red and sore. She never had time to rest at them anymore. She almost lost her sight. But teacher was stubborn too. She just held the books closer and read on. And together they won. In the fall of 1904, Helen Keller stood in line with 96 other girls. She felt a rolled-up piece of paper being put in her hand. This was her diploma. Helen Keller had graduated cum laude with honor from Radcliffe College. She was the best educated deaf-blind person in the world. Wow, what an accomplishment. So that was the end of chapter 9, Helen Keller. What an impressive girl she is.